Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Shanae, representing Harm to Healing, and we are growing an ecosystem that builds power for communities impacted by racialized criminalisation to create systems of healing, safety, and justice. First and foremost, we want to stand in love and solidarity with Henry Nowak, his family, his loved ones, and all those grieving this devastating loss. The footage released in recent days has been deeply distressing to watch. What we witnessed in Henry's final moments was a serious level of inhumanity, and for many of the individuals, families, and organizations and communities represented here today, this is not new. For decades, Black and racialized communities impacted by policing, criminalization, and state violence have been campaigning about the use of force, the violence, the lack of care-focused responses, the lack of healing support, and the ways in which people have been dehumanized by systems that claim to keep us safe. Today, we want to honor the lives of all those who have been killed, harmed, criminalized, traumatized through state violence. We uplift the families and communities who have spent years seeking truth, accountability, and justice. We have convened this press conference because we believe this moment needs honesty about the realities of police violence in this country. We are extremely concerned that Henry's tragic death is being used to forward agendas rooted in division, racism, and hatred. And we want to echo the explicit and courageous call from Henry's family and loved ones that this tragedy must not be weaponized. Grief should never be exploited for political gain. We refuse to allow this loss of life to be reduced to narratives that divide communities against one another. Instead, I want us to focus on the serious issues raised by this footage, concerns about police violence, accountability, and safety, and to have conversations about how we can truly bring about change. Harm to Healing exists because we believe another way is possible. Our work brings together directly impacted people, families, practitioners, organizers, community leaders who are committed to building systems rooted in true care, dignity, healing, and accountability. We know that real safety cannot come through systems that rely on violence and harm. We are here to offer a different narrative and a new opportunity to build something new that is rooted in humanity, truth, accountability, and hope. We must invest in building something different. We deserve systems of care, healing, true safety, and real protection. Our hope is that this moment can be one of collective reflection and that we can move towards a shared commitment to change. We believe that another way is possible. We believe that healing is possible. And I believe that together we can create systems that are truly just, compassionate, and safe for everyone. Thank you. I would now like to invite Stafford Scott from Tottenham Rights to the stage.
Hi, my name's Stafford Scott. I'm the director of Tottenham Rights Community Interest Company, and I'm also a guest professor of forensic architecture at Goldsmiths University. Britain is being asked to believe something that is simply not true. The tragic murder of Henry Nowak has been used by Nigel Farage and others to claim that Britain operates a two-tier policing system. I'm sorry, but that actually means that Black people are treated more favourably by police officers in this country than white people are. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. There is no evidence whatsoever for that claim. And those politicians who are making that claim, they provide you with no evidence whatsoever. It's a dog whistle. There's never been any evidence. What we do have, the reason why we even saw the tragedy that happened to Henry was because police were wearing body-worn cameras. The reason why those police officers are wearing body-worn cameras is as a direct result and consequence of the Black community's experiences and our campaigns to put cameras on police officers for accountability. So there isn't any evidence that backs up the claim that they've made. There never was. What we have and what we've had for decades is overwhelming evidence of racial disparity, racial disproportionality in the opposite direction. Black people are significantly more likely to be stopped and searched, more likely to be arrested, and more likely to experience the use of force. They're also far more likely to die following restraint by police. That's not opinion. That's not ideology. That is published fact. And it's published by the very institutions that create the disproportionality in the first place. This is how warped it is. It's published fact because we've had a number of public inquiries, judge-led, not politician-led, judge-led public inquiries. That means they're based on facts, from Scarman to Macpherson. And that was into the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, because his name is being brought into this a lot at the moment. And the only comparison with Stephen Lawrence that this outrageous killing has is the way that the police responded to both victims. They treated them as though they were the criminals. So let's be clear. The conclusion has always been consistent. Racism exists within British policing. And not once in over 60 years of investigations into British policing has there been evidence of institutional anti-white policing. It's farcical, it's a nonsense. So when we hear claims of two-tier policing, we need to understand that they are what they are. They're not evidence-based, they're political. They're part of a familiar pattern, one identified nearly 50 years ago by Stuart Hall. Create fear, find a target, and turn complex social problems into simple blame. Now let me say this clearly, the murder of Henry Nowak is a tragedy, totally. His family deserved justice, nothing should take away from that. But justice is not served by using that tragedy to promote a false narrative. And it's not served by suggesting that entire communities should be judged by the actions of one criminal individual. Black communities in this country know exactly what that feels like, because we've lived with this kind of stereotyping for generations. At the same time, new forms of justification for excessive police violence are still emerging in our communities. As a guest professor with forensic architecture, I'm part of a team currently investigating the state's use of the term excited delirium, a discredited pseudo-medical diagnosis repeatedly invoked to explain deaths following extreme restraint. The term has been cited in cases such as the death of Roger Sylvester, Sean Rigg, Shaku Bayu, and as far afield as George Floyd in the United States. It draws on long-standing racial stereotypes, particularly the myth of black men possessing superhuman strength to justify the use of excessive and often fatal force. That such a concept could be embedded in official narratives tells us everything we need to know about how deeply these patterns persist. They're not isolated issues, they're part of a pattern. So the real danger here is not just misinformation, it's that these narratives are being used to undermine accountability and roll back the progress that we've fought for over 50 years of campaigning. We should be very careful about that, because the evidence is clear. The history is clear. The question is not whether racism exists in policing. The question is why some people are so determined to deny its very existence. But we all know that we don't fix injustice by inventing new ones. We fix it by facing the truth. And the truth is, this particular case isn't really about race or ethnicity. It's about police mistreatment of a victim. But people need to understand this is about policing. And that's how the police respond. What we saw is standard operating procedures. Who calls the police first sometimes gets a police service. Who the police are then turned onto, they get the attack dogs. They get the police force. So in this case, and as a result of our history, black and brown people tend not to always call the police. They're generally called on us, and then we get handcuffed even when we're the victims. If two of us are in a fight, both of us get handcuffed, and the police will look at you and say, we don't know who is the protagonist, we don't know who's the victim, you're going to stay in handcuffs until we've investigated this. So let's put the spotlight where it needs to be shone. The spotlight needs to be shone on policing. It's not about race, it's not about ethnicity, and it's not about stereotyping any single community. To do that is to do a disservice, not just to the community that you're targeting and attacking, but it does a disservice to our very community and our very way of life and so-called British values. Thank you.
Thank you, Stafford. I would now like to invite Marcia from the United Friends and Family campaign to the stage.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. My name is Marcia Rick. I'm a leading member of the United Families and Friends campaign. It's a coalition of families that have been traumatized and harmed by the British state. It was set up back in the late 90s following the brutal death of Joy Gardner, Roger Sylvester, and Brian Douglas. It was set up by black families because young black men were dying disproportionately at the hands of the state. Nearly 27 years later, it now consists of all families of all ethnic, of all races, including white people, who are also affected by deaths in custody. The British police also kill their own. And I'd like to speak a bit about the emotional impact on families, especially when we watch the footage and hearing the public's concerns that unfolded. When I watched that video, it reminded me of my brother, Sean Rigg, that died in 2008, following an episode where he was required an emergency attention and to be taken to the hospital. And watching that footage was cruel and insensitive by those officers. This was a man, a young boy, 17 I think he was, that was in need of emergency attention, and he was actually dying, and he did die right there. And he said the words, "I can't breathe." That is something that has been said by many young men, black and white, have said the words, "I can't breathe." And I'd like to remind you of the death of Kevin Clark, where it was caught on body-worn footage. He suffered with mental health, he was in a crisis, and he was on the floor, and he was saying, "I can't breathe, and I'm dying." All 9 officers that were there next to him all claimed that they did not hear those words. But if you listen to the footage, just like Henry Clark, where he said, "I can't breathe and I'm being stabbed," they must have heard them. But nothing happened to the officers. It's a common pattern when people come into contact with the police and they are vulnerable and they receive a death sentence rather than the care and the dignity that they deserved. Handcuffing people is nothing new, especially when there's no threat. Particularly, as Stafford said, black men are afforded or not afforded the decency because excessive force is used with X amount of officers. We've just seen, just a few weeks ago, the horrific death of Eve Salick in Ireland. where about at least 6 security officers murdered, in my opinion, in broad daylight, a young Congolese man, Eve. And everybody saw that footage. My understanding is that when the police arrived, he was handcuffed. And he was definitely no threat. If he was not dead, which I believe he was, when I studied the footage myself, he was certainly unresponsive. In the footage, you can see where the men that were restraining him, after about 2 minutes or so, in my opinion, they were checking his pulse and they knew that he was seriously unwell. What did they tell the police when they arrived? Why did the police handcuff a dead man or a dying man? And that's what happened to my brother. Sean died in handcuffs. And I can name a few others that died in the same way. Kevin Clark, Adrian McDonald, Shaney Lewis, Christopher Alder, Kingsley Burrell, Edson DaCosta, Rashan Charles, Deji Amashori, Eve Salek. And I will name some young white men that also died with handcuffs, such as Mark Cole, Darren Neville, James Herbert. We have other people like Darren Cumberbatch. The list is endless. And often the police say that they are faking it, that they are pretending to be unconscious, that they are pretending to be dead. They use tasers on them and batons. These are all excessive force. But apparently, they excited themselves to death by the use of the term excited delirium. And another term that's now being used is acute behavioral disorder, that's what killed them, and that the restraint had nothing to do with it. And that's absolute nonsense. We have the Independent Office of Police Conduct, who are investigating the case of Henry. They say it will take 3 months. In my case, it took 11 years for a final report to be done. And in many instances, in the cases that I know, black and or white, it takes months for them to even interview the officers that were there at the time. And the issue of disclosure and getting the evidence. And it takes years. It can take at least 3 years, even 7 years and more for an inquest to find out how that somebody died. And in my particular brother's case, the IOPC paid in secret with the Home Office compensation to the officers for the trauma that caused them. Trauma and the pain and the length of the case. When it was them in the first place that prolonged the investigation and nothing happened to them in the end. And what about the families? Just as Henry's family are traumatized, and quite rightly so, when they saw the footage of their son, when the officers treated him cruelly and with no dignity. I've noticed that Keir Starmer has met with the family, and I'm happy about that. But the United Families and Friends have been writing to the Prime Minister for 27 years. And in every letter, we've asked for a meeting with the Prime Minister, including Keir Starmer. We wrote to him last year and the year before. They have never afforded any of the black families to meet with the Prime Minister. I met Keir Starmer when he was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. He knows about the deaths. Keir Starmer is also a lawyer. He acted for families, black families, where excessive use of force was used and they died in controversial circumstances. Why has he not afforded that same to everybody? Sarah Everard was murdered by a police officer. But he is the only police officer in British history that has received a whole full life sentence, and quite rightly so. But I must add that Sarah Everard was white. What about Joy Gardner? Cherry Gross? There are so many. There is stark contrast. And I don't want to hear about police training, because it's always lessons will be learned, but they never learn their lessons. What amount of training does somebody need to know that when somebody is in distress, you don't handcuff them? Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. I would like to invite Kojo from Black Lives Matter UK to the stage, please.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Kojo Chirwa. I am National Organiser for Black Lives Matter UK. But the first thing I wanted to acknowledge is I wanted to thank Harm to Healing for holding this space. It's important for us to not only acknowledge the death of Henry Nowak, but also address the questions that have been raised in this moment. Black Lives Matter, first of all, we stand with every family that has lost their loved ones in police custody. The grief of the Nowak family should not be weaponized, but it should be acknowledged and it should be respected. As Mark Nowak said, that he did not want his son's death to be stirred up division or hatred or to be exploited in any way. He also asked that his son's story should be used to build greater safety. So the question for us is to really consider that. But before we go into how we build greater safety, I want to think through what has happened. What has happened is a young man has lost his life because he was stabbed, but also because the police did not respond to his call for help. When he said, "I can't breathe," the police minimized it. The police did not acknowledge it. The police did not take it seriously. This is so similar to many cases that the United Families and Friends campaign against deaths in custody has addressed, that has supported. It's so similar, and yet it keeps happening. Why? The reason why the police do not respond with care and dignity is because, as Stafford has already said, that is their standing operating procedure. They do not treat people with dignity and respect when they are calling for that, when they're calling for help. And so what we want to talk about is, how do we build this greater safety? As Henry's death was a matter of death in police custody, what we want to acknowledge is that why the police did that was nothing to do with his race. It was nothing to do with ethnicity, and it's everything to do with how the police operate more generally. But what we've seen is that his death has been weaponized. His death has been exploited by Farage, by J.D. Vance, many others. They are pushing it as if the police are biased against white people. When we look at the evidence published by the government, that when it comes to people who are more likely to be stopped in search, it's black people, 3 times more likely than white people. Who's more likely to die after following use of police restraint? It's black people, 7 times more likely than white people. The idea that white people are being discriminated against by the police force in terms of violence is a nonsense conspiracy theory. And it's absolutely shameful that any press or politician pushes this idea as if it's a serious consideration. It's an insult to all the families that have died, white, black, and Asian. Black Lives Matter has supported people from all backgrounds whose loved ones have died in custody. Whether it is the Alan Marshall family in Scotland, we've been there to support them. UFFC has supported every background, people who have died in police custody. Our concern is not pushing race theories. Our concern is building safety for all. That is what we want. And so we propose that there are 3 things that we can do. We don't believe that the police exist for our safety. I'll get that very clear. We believe that the police, and I'm talking about Black Lives Matter UK, we believe that the police are violence workers. They do not exist to protect us. They exist to protect property and the rich. That is their interest. But despite that, They have this power over life and death over us. And as they do, we call for free, immediate changes. When anybody in a police custody says, I can't breathe, as did Henry Nowak, as did Kevin Clark, the police's response, mandatory, should be to check that they are okay, to check their breathing. And if they've put them in restraint, to stop that immediately. That has to happen. And the reason it has not happened for over the last how many years of these incidences happening over and over again, it's not because of anti-racist policies that have been put in place since 2020. It's because that they do not put people's care at the forefront of their minds. And we are calling for that to change right now. That's how we build greater safety. The second thing we should be looking at the police is that they should be building a culture of zero disregard. If anyone, again, is in distress and they are self-reporting that they are in trouble, the police should respond, or the first responder should respond with that and take that as the utmost priority, not keeping them in handcuffs, not minimizing their situation. And the third thing that we need immediately to ensure this happens, because we do not trust the police to mark their own homework or to adhere to policies that are set out. We need community oversight, greater community oversight. The Home Office already publishes use of force statistics on a database, but that is entirely reliant on the police self-reporting. We need community oversight to actually go over and see if these reports are true, to check and report on missing cases or underreported cases. That community oversight is essential for ensuring that if the police are not responding in the correct way, that is being met with disciplinary procedures. If any officer who hears I can't breathe leaves that person, and that person then is worsened in their health or dies as a result, that should be something that is immediately followed up with disciplinary procedures. What we have right now is an opportunity to change things, to move away from the conspiracy theories of Farage and others and actually build greater safety. This violence that has happened on the streets has been used to demonize entire communities. Politicians are talking about burning the kirpan, this ceremonial knife that was allegedly used. The Sikh community says it was not that. But we're now hearing debates about banning that ceremonial knife, that religious practice, for 430,000 Sikhs because of the act of one man. What is that? That's racism. That's how racism operates. And so as we organize, as we call for these changes, we can do two things. We can either allow this violence to turn on us, do the very things that Tommy Robinson and others would like us to do, or we can look to each other for support and solidarity. We can build the change that we all need. Solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kojo. I would now like to invite Sahra from Harm to Healing.
Hi, my name is Sarah Baffer. I'm a part of Harm to Healing and I'm a community organizer. Thank you all for being here today. We gather at a painful moment. In the wake of the release of footage showing the treatment of Henry Nowak by the police in the final moments after he sustained fatal injuries, we come together here first and foremost to show solidarity with Henry's family, loved ones, and community. Our communities here today know the heartbreak of witnessing and hearing the words, "I can't breathe." At this moment, there are many voices seeking to tell us how to respond. Some seek accountability, some seek truth, some seek healing. But there are those who seek division. In the days following this tragedy, we have once again seen the attempts to pit communities against one another. We have seen the efforts to turn grief into resentment. We have seen the attempts to transform legitimate questions about policing into the attacks of migrants against Sikh communities, against Muslims, against refugees, and other racialized communities. We reject that entirely. It's also necessary to name the role of sections of the media class in shaping this terrain. The media has not simply acted upon a vacuum. It has also represented and perpetrated far-right and right-wing media. And too often, that framing has historically contributed to racialized division rather than understanding the necessity of creating a unified working class struggle. This division has been amplified by the media, and the media has repeatedly helped construct the public discourse in ways that displays accountability away from institutions and towards already marginalized communities. We are seeing this play out, and through the so-called two-tier system, which again is a far-right narrative. This narrative asks us to believe that the problem is not police violence, institutional racism, and social abandonment, or a lack of accountability. It instead tells us that the certain communities are somehow receiving special treatment, and these communities are Black people. We know that this is not true. We know that policing has historically violated and harmed our communities. It instead tells us that we are the problem and not institutional racism and violence. This framing is not only divisive, it's ahistorical. It ignores decades of evidence and testimonies from families here today. From the policing of Black communities under the SUS laws in the 1970s and 80s, to the deaths of Cynthia Jarrett, Joe Gardiner, Sean Riggs, Mark Duggan, Chris Cabot, and Kevin Clark. These are people who were harmed and murdered by the police. We also know what happened to Sarah Reid. Policing does not serve our communities. It reproduces oppression and protects the status quo. Our communities have consistently raised the concerns about discriminatory policing and the absence of meaningful accountability for and by the people. These are not isolated tragedies, but are part of a wider historical pattern that has been documented through lived experience and campaigning, and again here today by families impacted by police violence. To name this is not to diminish the pain of Henry's death or the grief carried by his family. Their loss is real, profound, and deserving of dignity, truth, and accountability. Nothing about this analysis seeks to flatten or minimize the suffering. Rather, it is precisely this, that grief is so significant that it should not be weaponized within media narratives to redirect public anger onto other communities who are themselves subjected to violence, neglect, and discrimination, because policing impacts us all. When sections of the media amplify diverse framing like two-tier policing, they do not do so in a vacuum. These narratives have consequences. They shape public perception in ways that legitimize resentment, deepen mistrust within communities, and also amplify right-wing narratives. This is not new. Historically, media ecosystems have repeatedly played a role in circulating fear and moral panic at moments of social crisis, often reinforcing rather than challenging the state's oppressive power. We know that this is amplifying division within communities rather than actually creating a unified struggle. In doing so, attention is shifted away from structural questions of accountability, not with those who treated, not with the systems. There's a path towards justice. There's a path towards us unifying instead of reproducing far-right narratives. We must be clear about where that leads to. These narratives do not remain abstract. They are taken up politically, amplified further, and once again justify the hostility between racialized communities. The media class is not separate from this process. It is a part of how it becomes normalized. We must refuse this trap. We know the answer is collective struggle for justice for everyone. No community becomes safer when another is targeted. No family finds healing through racism. No society becomes more than just division. Our task is to build solidarity powerful enough to confront the conditions that produce suffering in the first place. This means standing with families seeking accountability. This means challenging racism in all forms. It also means refusing media narratives designed to inflame fear and hostility. It's also about building community-led vision that is rooted in safety, care, and dignity, and accountability and healing rather than punishment, exclusion, and force. Because liberation has always depended on all of us. And if we're going to create a future beyond violence, beyond criminalisation, and beyond harm that is being used today by the far-right media and also the fascists, it will not be through division. It will be through solidarity and a unified struggle against all working-class people.
I would now like to invite Temi from the Forefront Project.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I am here representing Forefront. It's a community-led youth organisation that for over a decade has supported young people and been on a mission to heal communities by building peace, knowledge, and power. We are deeply disturbed by Henry Nowak's treatment by police in his dying moments, but sadly, we are not surprised. We'd like to extend love, support, and solidarity to his family and loved ones, and just acknowledge that Henry's repeated calls for help and medical attention should have been enough. Every young person deserves dignity, care, and protection, especially in their moments of greatest need. For years, those of us working alongside young people and communities impacted by violence have raised really serious concerns about the neglect and dehumanization that too often characterize police responses. We have seen young people who are injured, traumatized, and in crisis denied basic care, dignity, and compassion, even when they are victims of violence themselves. Contact with the police should never mean your basic rights and basic human needs are completely disregarded. What happened to Henry is deeply disturbing, but it is not unfamiliar to many communities across this country. That's why so many people across the country have been deeply affected by watching the footage of Henry's final moments. And whilst for some this may be the first time witnessing this type of treatment, and they might have found it extremely harrowing to watch, for many of us it was very painfully familiar. For families and communities directly impacted by police violence, deaths following police contact, and state harm, the events of the last week have actually been deeply triggering, reopening painful wounds and memories. What has made this even harder is that in the majority of these circumstances, these incidents, there has been no accountability and no justice. Families have spent years and often decades fighting to have their loved ones' humanity recognized and their experiences heard. This case has brought into wider public view a reality that many families and communities have been speaking about for generations. Policing often exacerbates harm rather than addressing it, and many young people in particular leave contact with the police carrying additional trauma that they also need support to heal from. We have witnessed young people routinely violated, criminalized, and dehumanized, even when they are victims of violence. Young people are too often treated as risks to be managed rather than human beings in need of care and support. From strip searching children to excessive use of force, we have witnessed inhumane and degrading treatment, and it has become normalized. We have been raising concerns about these practices in our communities for years. If you did not know this was happening, let this be your wake-up call. We've been warning about this for decades, and what we witnessed in Henry's final moments, unfortunately, cannot be said is an isolated incident. It actually reflects a wider culture of policing, and we have to talk about that we as a society have normalized things that should never be seen as normal: the strip searching of children, handcuffing injured people, ignoring cries for help, using extreme force when people are in distress, treating vulnerability as suspicion. What happened to Henry should force us to question how many of these things have become accepted as normal in our society today. Violence affecting young people deserves serious attention. The loss of any young life should concern us all. Communities across the country are carrying really profound grief because of this violence, and we should be having serious conversations about how we can prevent harm, how we can support young people, and how we can create safer communities. We can't have those conversations, honestly, if we ignore the harms created by policing itself. Young people are often harmed twice. This is one of the most painful realities of working with young people. First, the violence that they suffer, and then by the systems that are meant to respond to it. Too many young people who are victims of violence are treated as suspects, denied compassion when they need support, leaving interactions with police by carrying that additional trauma. And some, too many, have not survived those interactions with the police. In the aftermath of tragedies like this, there are often renewed calls for more policing, more enforcement, and harsher responses. We are actually already seeing Henry's death being weaponized, being used to justify calls for more policing and tougher criminal legal system responses. But let's ask a simple question. If policing is the answer, why are so many people still being harmed? For over a decade at Forefront, we've worked alongside young people that have been impacted by violence, and what we have learned is that safety cannot be built through surveillance, criminalization, and punishment. Safety is built through relationships, support, healing, opportunity, trusted adults, youth work, and community support. Despite attempts to use this tragedy to spread division, we must remain grounded in the facts. Black and racialized communities continue to be disproportionately harmed by policing, state violence, and contact with the criminal legal system. This is not an opinion. It is evidenced repeatedly through inquiries, reviews, research, and our lived experience. Every major inquiry into policing and racism in Britain has reached the same conclusion, and we cannot allow Henry's death to be used to erase the realities that Black communities have spent generations fighting to have recognized. We cannot honor Henry's life by denying the reality experienced by countless other families. Facing these truths is not divisive, it is necessary. But this should be a moment of solidarity. There are people who have sought to use Henry's death to divide our communities, and we reject that completely. If people are outraged by how Henry was treated, we invite them to stand alongside the families and communities who've been raising these concerns for decades, not because the experiences are identical, but because no one should be treated this way. Not Henry, not anyone. This should be a moment for communities to unite around truth, accountability, and care. A key question that needs foregrounding in this conversation is, where is the care? What support exists for young people after they experience violence? What support exists for families who have experienced state violence? What support exists for communities carrying grief, trauma, and fear? What support exists for the loved ones left behind? Accountability matters, but healing matters too. And too often our communities are left to carry that burden alone. What happened to Henry should force a reckoning with the reality that policing causes profound harm to many young people across the country. And on behalf of Black communities who know this treatment all too well, we offer our sincere love and solidarity to Henry's loved ones. The police must be held accountable in this case. They must be held accountable in all cases, but accountability alone is not enough. If we are serious about keeping all young people safe, we must unite around a different vision of safety, one that invests in care, in healing and community-led support, rather than systems that repeatedly fail young people. Our young people deserve better, our communities deserve better, and Henry deserved better. Thank you.
So today we have heard about the realities of police violence, the impacts of state harm, and the grief that our communities and young people are left to carry. As Temi said, when families and communities experience state violence, they're left to seek accountability and to navigate the trauma and loss without the care, without the support, the healing that communities really need, never offered, resourced, or prioritized, and the system is not working. There are countless families, organizers, practitioners, and community members who care deeply about creating genuine safety in our communities. People are already doing this work of advocating for justice and building something different. To build communities where people are met with care in moments of crisis. To build responses that value human life and dignity. To build systems and structures that help people to heal rather than to create more harm. So I invite you to join us in imagining and creating something different. To join us in asking what real safety and justice can look like in our communities, across all of our communities. To join us in building communities that are free from violence and free from state harm. And to join us in holding on to the hope that healing, justice, and safety is possible. And I say that with love, strength, and hope. Thank you.